If you trace the Bourbon Dynasty back far enough, you reach a patchwork of castles, small towns, and the slow-moving politics of medieval France, a landscape dominated less by grand kings and more by the quiet accumulation of land, alliances and family connection. The name Bourbon itself evokes power now, but in its earliest centuries, it was little more than a regional identifier associated with a series of lords whose ambitions were measured in sheepflocks, grain fields, and the careful management of vassals. The Bourbon family's roots lie deep in the forests and plains of central France, where rivers curved gently through fields and towns like Bourbon-l'Archambault, which lent its name to the family, were quiet enough that centuries of history could pass almost unnoticed. In the early 11th century, the first recorded Bourbon lord, Aymar de Bourbon, held modest lands along the Allier River. He was not a king, not even a prince in the way the neighboring dukes of Burgundy or the counts of Anjou might have been. Instead, his life was defined by the slow cycles of planting and harvest and maintenance of a small castle, and the careful negotiation of loyalty to the larger powers around him. It was a time when the idea of France itself was fragile, a collection of territories bound loosely under a monarch whose reach rarely extended beyond the royal court and the occasional call to war. The Bourbons were minor players, yet their survival and eventual rise depended on mastering this environment of quiet diplomacy, incremental gains, and cautious marriages. Marriage, in particular, was the slow machinery of dynastic ambition. Unlike the romantic notions that history sometimes paints, marriage in the medieval period was transactional, a deliberate weaving of alliances designed to strengthen lands, secure borders, and enhance influence. Early Bourbons understood this instinctively. In the 13th century, Archambaud VIII, Count of Bourbon, made a pivotal marital choice that would alter the family's trajectory. By marrying the heiress of the Bourbon estates, he consolidated holding. That gave the family a greater territorial footprint in central France. This move was not dramatic at the time; it barely registered beyond a few neighboring lords, but it planted the seeds for centuries of incremental power accumulation. In many ways, the Bourbons' rise was like the slow layering of sediment, unremarkable day-to-day activity eventually forming a rock solid enough to support a palace. During these centuries, the Bourbons were also shaped by the wars that rippled across France. The 100 Years' War, often remembered in grand narratives of Joan of Arc or the Siege of Orleans, was also a long series of minor disruptions for families like the Bourbons. Fields went untended, taxes fluctuated, and loyalties shifted not out of ideology but necessity. For a lord like the Bourbon, survival required meticulous record-keeping of debts, careful stockpiling of grain, and attentiveness to the moods of both king and neighboring barons. These details, how to collect taxes without sparking rebellion, how to manage small retinues of knights, how to respond to bandits or an unruly peasantry, were the real foundations of power. History tends to focus on battles and proclamations, but the Bourbon story, at least in these early centuries, was more about the quiet persistence of administrative competence. By the late 14th century, the Bourbons had become recognizable as a significant noble family. Their influence was still regional rather than national, centered in the Duchy of Bourbonnais, a swath of central France that included fertile farmland, modest towns, and strategically placed castles. The Bourbon castle at Bourbon-l'Archambault itself had been expanded over generations, from a simple motte and bailey into a stone fortress capable of withstanding sieges. Life inside these walls, however, was far from luxurious by modern standards. Lords and their families endured the chill of stone chambers in winter, ate simple meals of bread, cheese, and stewed meats, and relied heavily on servants and laborers to maintain the household. Ceremonial life existed, of course, but it was measured in the routine observation of mass, the careful hosting of neighboring lords, and the maintenance of honor and reputation in ways that could seem tedious to anyone accustomed to drama-filled histories. The Bourbon ascent was also aided by their relationships with the royal family. Kings of France, seeking allies in the provinces, often granted lands, titles, or privileges to families like the Bourbons in exchange for loyalty. The Bourbons demonstrated remarkable patience in navigating this system. They did not rebel frivolously, they did not overreach, and they seldom drew attention for rashness. Instead, they cultivated a reputation for reliability, a trait that would prove invaluable centuries later, when a Bourbon would sit on the French throne. In this sense, the dynasty's story is a reminder that much of history is composed of quiet choice, the accumulation of trust and small advantages rather than dramatic turning points. It is worth pausing to consider the lives of the ordinary people who lived under Bourbon rule in these centuries. Peasants, craftsmen, and servants experienced history not in the form of royal marriages or territorial disputes, but through seasonal rhythms, obligations to their lord, and the occasional disruption caused by conflict or disease. A peasant harvesting wheat in the Bourbon lands in the 14th century likely had no notion of the dynasty's future significance. Yet their labor grinding grain, repairing roads, maintaining castles was integral to the Bourbons' ability to consolidate power. In this way, the dynasty's rise was intimately connected to the mundane, day-to-day life of ordinary medieval French people whose names have largely been lost to history but whose contributions were essential. By the 16th century, the Bourbons were firmly established as one of France's leading noble families, though still far from royal status. They held the title of Count of Clermont and later Prince of Condé, signifying their increasing influence and proximity to the royal family. The French monarchy, under kings such as Francis I, was centralizing authority, codifying laws, and fostering the arts and sciences. For the Bourbons, this period involved careful positioning, aligning with the crown without overcommitting, expanding lands through marriage, and ensuring that their lineage remained attractive for future royal connection. They cultivated a dual identity, loyal subjects, and ambitious nobility, navigating the delicate balance between service and self-interest. Religion played an equally quiet but critical role in the Bourbon ascent. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation swept through Europe, introducing theological debate and religious conflicts that touched even the quiet castles of central France. The Bourbons, like many noble families, had to navigate these tensions carefully. Some branches leaned Protestant, others remained staunchly Catholic, and the choices affected alliances, marriages, and the perception of legitimacy. By the late 16th century, Henry IV himself, a Bourbon, would inherit not only the mantle of the family's land and titles, but also the complicated religious and political legacy that centuries of careful maneuvering had produced. What is striking about this early history is its profound ordinariness. Unlike the dramatic tales of kings and battles that dominate textbooks, the Bourbon centuries-long rise was measured, methodical, and punctuated by countless small decisions: which daughter to marry, which neighboring lord to appease, how to manage a winter grain shortage, which taxes to enforce without rebellion. Yet this ordinariness belies its significance. By quietly securing lands, marriages, and loyalties over generations, the Bourbons positioned themselves to eventually ascend to the French throne, shaping the destiny of France in ways that could never have been predicted by their medieval ancestors. And here lies the lingering question as this first chapter of their story concludes: how did this methodical, almost painfully slow accumulation of regional influence prepare a family like the Bourbons for the dizzying pressures of kingship, court intrigue, and revolution centuries later? When Henry IV finally stepped onto the French throne, he inherited not just titles and lands, but centuries of careful groundwork. Yet could centuries of quiet, bureaucratic competence truly prepare a dynasty for the relentless spectacle of national politics, religious conflict, and personal ambition that awaited them in the early modern era? As we move into the late 16th century, the Bourbon family, after centuries of quiet accumulation of land, loyalty, and influence, found itself at the threshold of an unprecedented transformation. The modest lords of Bourbon-Archambault, once preoccupied with the rhythms of peasant labor, taxes, and the occasional skirmish, were suddenly entwined in the grand tapestry of French national politics. This transition was not sudden. It had been centuries in preparation, yet it arrived at a time when the stakes of power had grown immeasurably. The question of survival, which had once been managed in quiet castle halls, now expanded to the scale of an entire kingdom divided by war, religion, and ambition. Henry of Navarre, later Henry IV of France, was the most pivotal figure in this transformation. Born in 1553, he represented a Bourbon line that had slowly grown in prominence, gaining titles like Prince of Condé and the strategically significant Kingdom of Navarre in southern France. His early life was framed by the constant tension between two forces that would define France for decades: the Catholic monarchy, which sought to assert centralized authority, and the rising Protestant Huguenot movement, which challenged both religious and political hegemony. From his earliest years, Henry's identity was shaped by these competing currents. As a Protestant in a predominantly Catholic kingdom, he learned early that survival often required compromise, foresight, and an almost obsessive calculation of risks, skills that would define not just his reign, but the very destiny of the Bourbon dynasty. Henry's youth was marked by careful education, the management of small-scale territories, and the cultivation of alliances that were less about personal affection and more about survival. He received rigorous training in languages, military tactics, and governance, the sort of practical skills that the Bourbons had quietly valued for generations. Yet his upbringing was also overshadowed by the chaos of the French wars of religion. These wars, beginning in 1562 and lasting intermittently until 1598, were far from the sweeping battlefield dramas often depicted in modern retellings. They were instead a patchwork of sieges, small battles, and local uprisings, each influencing the lives of ordinary people and noble families alike. For the Bourbons, every decision carried weight. Supporting one faction could secure new lands or allies. Supporting the other could result in ruin. Henry's own marriage politics illustrate the subtle, painstaking nature of Bourbon's strategy. In 1572, his marriage to Margaret of Valois, Catholic princess and sister of King Charles IX, was intended as a bridge between factions, an emblem of reconciliation. Yet the event quickly escalated into the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, in which thousands of Huguenots were killed across France. While Henry survived, narrowly by converting temporarily to Catholicism, the massacre underscored the delicate balance required for survival in a country divided by religion. Every familial alliance, every public appearance, every whispered counsel from advisors carried potential life or death consequences. The lesson Henry inherited from his Bourbon lineage, the slow accumulation of prudence, loyalty, and negotiation, was now being tested on a scale that would have been unimaginable to the lords of Bourbon-Archambault. Henry's rise to the French throne itself was a testament to the dynasty's centuries-long patience. When the Valois line ended with the assassination of Henry III in 1589, Henry of Navarre, as the senior Bourbon, became the legitimate heir to the French crown. Yet, legitimacy alone was insufficient. His accession was immediately contested by powerful Catholic factions. France, torn by religious war, presented Henry with a challenge far greater than any previous Bourbon lord had faced. Governing in this context demanded not only strategic marriages, treaties, and alliances, but also the ability to manage the expectation of a fragmented population, navigate foreign powers, and maintain the loyalty of armies that were often more mercenary than patriotic. Henry's methods of governance reflected the pragmatic, methodical nature of the Bourbons. He was not a ruler given to romantic or idealistic gestures. Instead, he relied on incremental, often dull, but crucial administrative reforms. He reorganized taxation to increase efficiency, implemented measures to stabilize the currency, and worked tirelessly to secure the loyalty of provincial governors. These efforts, while rarely dramatic, were essential for consolidating royal authority in a kingdom that had been fragmented for decades. Even the seemingly mundane decisions how to appoint local officials, which towns to fortify, how to manage grain reserves had enormous implications for the stability of the state. In this way, the qualities that had allowed the Bourbons to quietly ascend in regional politics, prudence, patience, and attention to detail, proved invaluable on the national stage. Religion, ever the undercurrent in Bourbon strategy, continued to shape Henry's reign. In 1593, in a move that shocked both Protestant and Catholic factions, he converted publicly to Catholicism, reportedly declaring, "Paris is worth a mass." This act was pragmatic rather than devout. It allowed him to consolidate power in the heart of France, pacify the Catholic League, and paved the way for the Bourbon Dynasty to hold the French crown firmly. Yet the conversion did not erase religious tensions. Henry had to carefully balance the demands of his former Protestant allies with those of the Catholic majority, using measured policies to allow relative religious tolerance while maintaining royal authority. This balancing act would define his rule and provide a template for governance that his successors would inherit. One of the less examined aspects of Henry's early reign was the quiet work of stabilizing daily life. Beyond grand battles and royal proclamations, the Bourbon monarchy under Henry IV focused on improving roads, bridges, and agricultural productivity, which were critical for feeding a war-weary population. He encouraged the cultivation of new crops, regulated marketplaces, and worked to standardize weights and measures to facilitate trade. These initiatives, lacking the drama of warfare, were nonetheless vital for establishing the economic foundation of Bourbon rule. Ordinary citizens may not have appreciated these reforms at the time, yet they reflected a consistent Bourbon characteristic: the careful, almost obsessive attention to systems and structures that could endure beyond any single monarch's lifetime. Henry's personal life also reflected the careful negotiation of family, politics, and survival that had characterized the Bourbons for centuries. He fathered children, both legitimate and illegitimate, recognizing that heirs were essential, not only for continuity, but also for forming alliances and securing loyalties. He cultivated relationships with noble families across France, weaving a complex web of ties that mirrored the marital strategies of his ancestors. These relationships were painstakingly managed, often involving long negotiations over dowries, estates, and titles. all while maintaining the appearance of royal dignity. The accumulation of these mundane yet strategic choices positioned the Bourbons not merely as rulers, but as a dynasty capable of navigating the multifaceted challenges of kingship. Yet, despite Henry's careful planning and incremental achievements, France remained fragile. Religious divisions simmered, regional lords occasionally resisted royal authority, and the pressures of war had left financial strains on the treasury. The kingdom's recovery would be slow, requiring the steady hand of a ruler who understood the value of meticulous administration. Here, the legacy of the early Bourbon lords became evident. The dynasty had been built not on sudden brilliance, but on centuries of small, deliberate actions, land acquisitions, alliances, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. It was a foundation sturdy enough to support a monarchy, yet delicate enough that missteps could undo generations of work. And so, as we reflect on the Bourbon rise in this period, a new question emerges. Could a dynasty built on patience, calculation, and careful administration endure the unpredictability of human ambition, revolutionary pressures, and the personal flaws of kings? Henry IV had brought the Bourbons to the pinnacle of power, yet the path ahead would demand far more than prudent governance. Could the methods that served minor lords in Bourbonnais for centuries truly withstand the pressures of ruling an entire kingdom? On the brink of transformation, where religion, finance, and public opinion were forces no single family could fully control. By the time Henry IV firmly established himself on the French throne in the late 16th century, the Bourbon dynasty had completed a remarkable, if understated, transformation. What had begun as a regional family of modest lords managing small estates in central France had evolved into the ruling house of a fractured, war-torn kingdom. Yet the path to monarchy was far from a sudden elevation. It was the product of centuries of slow, deliberate cultivation of land, alliances, and reputation. The dynasty's story illustrates the profound influence of ordinary, often boring historical processes, the accumulation of incremental advantages, the management of day-to-day governance, and the quiet negotiation of survival under ever-shifting political circumstances. Henry IV's reign provides the clearest example of this continuity. Ascending the throne at a time when France was exhausted by decades of religious warfare, he inherited a country plagued by financial strain, political instability, and social tension. Yet, armed with the methods and sensibilities cultivated over generations, Henry approached the monarchy with practicality and attention to detail. He prioritized what might seem mundane to the observer, restoring infrastructure, standardizing taxation, and ensuring agricultural production. Each of these measures was small and incremental in isolation, but collectively they laid the foundation for the stabilization of the French state. The Bourbon dynasty, once defined by careful territorial management and tactical marriages, now exercised its influence on a national stage through prudent governance and structural reform. One of the most emblematic policies of Henry's reign was the issuance of the Edict of Nantes in 1598. While its historical reputation is often framed in dramatic terms, the edict was, at its core, a practical solution to a deeply entrenched social problem. By granting a measure of religious tolerance to the Huguenots while maintaining Catholic primacy, Henry sought to reduce unrest, prevent civil war, and secure the loyalty of regions that had long been hostile to central authority. It was not a morally or religiously radical act, it was a calculated, administrative decision and extension of the Bourbon tradition of survival and methodical governance. The careful balance of rights, privileges, and obligations mirrored the centuries of negotiation, alliances, and land management that had defined the dynasty's rise from relative obscurity. Henry's personal qualities were also crucial to the consolidation of Bourbon authority. He was charismatic, politically astute, and willing to compromise when necessary. Yet these traits alone would not have sufficed. The dynasty's long history of prudence, built over centuries of cautious accumulation of power, provided him with the frameworks, expectations, and networks necessary to navigate the treacherous waters of French politics. The Bourbons' centuries of attention to detail, maintaining loyalty among vassals, cultivating advantageous marriages, managing estates, and surviving small-scale conflicts had equipped them to translate regional influence into national authority. In many ways, Henry IV's reign was the first moment in which the quiet competence of his ancestors bore fruit on a truly historic scale. The social and economic policies of Henry IV further illustrate the dynasty's methodical approach. Infrastructure improvements, such as repairing roads, bridges, and canals, facilitated trade and movement across the kingdom. Agricultural reforms, including the introduction of new crops and improved cultivation methods, helped stabilize food supplies and reduce famine risk. These initiatives, mundane in their immediate appearance, were critical to consolidating the Bourbon monarchy's authority. By securing the material well-being of the kingdom, Henry strengthened loyalty, reduced unrest, and created the conditions for a more centralized and durable state. Here again, the ordinary and administrative elements of governance, those tedious details of management, proved historically decisive. Yet, even as the Bourbon dynasty solidified its place on the French throne, challenges persisted. Religious tensions remained, regional autonomy occasionally flared into resistance, and the financial health of the kingdom required constant attention. Moreover, Henry IV's personal life was complicated by the pressure of kingship, balancing his numerous legitimate and illegitimate children, maintaining alliances through marriage, and managing the expectations of the nobility and commoners alike. These ongoing pressures highlight a central tension in the Bourbon narrative. The skills that enabled centuries of regional survival could only partially prepare a dynasty for the challenges of ruling a diverse and politically complex nation. The management of ordinary matters, the meticulous accounting of lands, taxes, and marriages, was necessary but not sufficient to guarantee enduring success at the national level. Despite these challenges, the legacy of the Bourbon rise remained undeniable. The dynasty had proven that careful, incremental strategies could yield extraordinary outcomes over time. From the unassuming lordships of Bourbon-Archambault to the Palace of the Louvre and eventually Versailles, the trajectory of the family illustrates how the slow accumulation of competence, loyalty, and strategic foresight could prepare a lineage for prominence and influence on a scale that would have seemed unimaginable to its medieval forebears. The dynasty's story is a testament to patience, persistence, and the enduring impact of what might appear, at first glance, to be the most mundane elements of governance. And yet, as Henry IV's reign drew to a close, questions lingered. Could a dynasty built on methodical prudence withstand the pressures of the future? France, still marked by social tension, financial strain, and political factionalism, would soon face challenges that no careful administration alone could fully resolve. Subsequent Bourbon kings, his son Louis XIII, grandson Louis XIV, and later generation, would inherit not just a throne, but a fragile equilibrium crafted over centuries of careful, boring work. The dynasty's strength lay in its methodical roots, yet its survival would increasingly depend on charisma, personal authority, and the ability to navigate the complexities of court politics, religious conflict, and eventually revolutionary upheaval. In reflecting on this long, quiet ascent, one sees that history often unfolds not in moments of sudden brilliance, but in centuries of meticulous, seemingly mundane action. The Bourbon dynasty's rise illustrates the subtle mechanics of survival and success: careful land management, strategic marriages, prudent alliances, and administrative competence. These ordinary choices accumulated over generations, enabling a family that once ruled a quiet corner of central France to inherit and stabilize a nation. It is a story of patience and persistence, of ordinary decisions with extraordinary consequences. And yet, the story leaves us with an enduring, contemplative question. How long can methodical prudence carry a dynasty when confronted with the volatility of human ambition, revolutionary ideals, and the inexorable pressures of history? The Bourbons had mastered survival and slow accumulation of power, but could these same techniques sustain them in the face of the rapid social and political upheavals that awaited France in the centuries to come? When you think of Henry IV of France, a few images often come to mind: a pragmatic king who brought stability to a fractured nation, the charismatic leader capable of charming both enemies and allies, and the man whose famous declaration, "Paris is worth a mass," has been repeated through centuries as evidence of political cunning. But behind these well-known phrases lies a life shaped by far more mundane, methodical survival strategy. A life rooted in a childhood of careful observation, political maneuvering, and incremental preparation. To understand Henry IV fully, one must step into the seemingly ordinary rhythms of his early life, where alliances were formed with contract and dowries rather than speeches, and where survival often depended on discretion more than valor. Henry was born in 1553 in Pau, in the Pyrenean region of Béarn. His father, Antoine de Bourbon, Duke of Vendôme, was a minor French noble with distant claim to the throne, and his mother, Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, was a committed Huguenot. From birth, Henry was enveloped in an environment shaped by politics, religion, and the slow accumulation of power. Pau itself was a small but fortified town, perched on the edge of the Pyrenees, with narrow streets, stone houses, and a castle that served as both home and political headquarters. This modest setting would frame Henry's early understanding of the precarious balance between power and survival. He saw firsthand that authority depended not solely on birthright, but on negotiation, vigilance, and strategic alliances. Religion, in particular, played a defining role in Henry's upbringing. His mother, Jean, was a fervent Protestant, and she imposed her faith rigorously on her children. Henry's early education combined classical studies, Latin, rhetoric, history with a religious curriculum that emphasized Protestant values, discipline, and moral responsibility. These lessons were not merely spiritual, they were political. In 16th century France, religion dictated allegiances, marriages, and the legitimacy of claims to land and titles. Young Henry learned that faith was intertwined with politics, and that religious identity could be a shield or a sword, depending on how it was wielded. Yet his education was not limited to the written word. From an early age, Henry was exposed to the intricacies of governance, management of estates, and the careful observation of human behavior. He witnessed the negotiation of taxes, the administration of courts, and the delicate balance between local lords and the crown. Even seemingly minor events deciding which noble family received a favor, resolving disputes over land, or determining the precise order of ceremonial precedence taught him lessons that would prove invaluable in later life. These experiences illustrate a key pattern in Bourbon strategy, the accumulation of knowledge through careful attention to ordinary, often tedious, details. Henry's adolescence was overshadowed by the French Wars of Religion, a series of conflicts between Catholics and Huguenots that would shape the entire country for decades. While history often highlights large battles, or the dramatic interventions of figures like Joan of Navarre or the Catholic League, the lived reality for Henry and his family was far more gradual and methodical. The wars manifested in sieges of towns, shifting alliances, and persistent threats to personal safety. Henry had to navigate these challenges cautiously, sometimes withdrawing to safe havens, other times negotiating truces or alliances. The stakes were clear. A single misstep could result in loss of land, influence, or life itself. From this environment, Henry developed a keen understanding of timing, pragmatism, and the necessity of compromise. Marriage, as with the Bourbons before him, was a critical instrument of political strategy. In 1572, Henry married Margaret of Valois, sister of King Charles IX. The union was intended as a bridge between Protestant and Catholic factions, and as a symbolic reconciliation between the warring parties. Yet the circumstances of this marriage reveal the precariousness of political alliances. Within days of the wedding, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre erupted, targeting Huguenots throughout France. Thousands were killed, and Henry himself narrowly survived by converting temporarily to Catholicism. The event was not merely a dramatic, historical footnote. It was a defining lesson in survival, political pragmatism, and the complexity of balancing personal faith with public duty. Henry learned that allegiance and identity could be instruments of negotiation rather than rigid markers of principle. By the time Henry assumed the title of King of Navarre in 1572, was already deeply versed in the art of negotiation and the calculus of risk. His dual identity as a Protestant prince and a legitimate heir to French territories required constant vigilance. Local governors, neighboring lords, and even members of his own family could act opportunistically. Every decision, no matter how small, had ramifications for security, legitimacy, and influence. He learned to weigh options carefully: when to fight, when to retreat, when to compromise, and when to assert authority. These lessons were the quiet, invisible training that would prepare him to ascend the French throne, not with the brashness of ambition, but with the measured, calculated strategies honed over decades of observation and experience. Henry's approach to governance was shaped not only by threats and alliances, but also by the minutiae of administration. He studied the management of estates, the enforcement of justice, and the collection of taxes, all seemingly mundane matters, yet crucial for consolidating authority. The ability to organize resources efficiently, maintain loyalty among officials, and anticipate potential dispute was what allowed him to stabilize the regions under his control even amidst ongoing religious conflict. This administrative competence became a hallmark of his later reign as King of France, demonstrating how the boring aspect of rule record keeping, oversight of harvests, regulation of trade often determined the long-term success of a dynasty. Henry's character, shaped in this crucible of political, religious, and administrative training, blended pragmatism, charm, and cautious calculation. He developed a reputation for wit and approachability, using personal charisma to negotiate complex political landscapes. Yet this charisma was always guided by strategic thought. He knew when to display warmth, when to negotiate, and when to conceal true intentions. The duality, the combination of personal appeal and careful calculation, would be crucial when he eventually became King of France. It allowed him to unite a fractured kingdom, bridge religious divides, and assert authority without immediate resort to force, relying on a combination of diplomacy, pragmatism, and administrative skill. By the late 1580s, as the Valois line of French kings neared extinction, Henry's position became both clearer and more perilous. As the senior Bourbon heir, he was the legitimate claimant to the French throne. Yet legitimacy alone did not guarantee acceptance. The Catholic League resisted his accession, and much of France remained skeptical of a Protestant king. His careful upbringing, meticulous preparation, and cultivated alliances now faced their greatest test. Could a man trained in the slow, methodical art of negotiation and survival navigate the sudden demands of national kingship, where religion, public perception, and the ambitions of others collided in unpredictable ways? As we reflect on Henry IV's early life, one sees the intersection of ordinary and extraordinary historical forces. His survival, rise, and eventual accession were built not on sudden genius alone, but on centuries of Bourbon strategies. Careful land management, strategic marriages, attention to bureaucratic detail, and the cultivation of loyalty. These qualities, accumulated over generations, enabled him to navigate the perilous environment of 16th century France and prepared him for the monumental challenge of ruling a nation divided by religion and politics. And yet, even at this pivotal moment, a lingering question remains: could the same methods that had guided Henry through a precarious youth and local governance suffice to unite a nation, stabilize a kingdom, and secure a dynasty's future when faced with the larger, relentless forces of history? The answer would unfold only in the years ahead, as he transitioned from Protestant prince to Catholic king, balancing the demands of faith, politics, and survival in a country still wary of his rule. The transition from Henry of Navarre, a regional prince of a Protestant kingdom, to Henry IV, King of France, was neither immediate nor smooth. When Henry ascended to the French throne in 1589, following the assassination of Henry III, the country was a fractured, exhausted, and deeply suspicious landscape. The wars of religion had left their mark. Towns and fields lay in ruin. Trade was disrupted, and political alliances were fragile at best. Local lords, accustomed to the chaos of civil war, were often hesitant to pledge allegiance to a monarch whose legitimacy they doubted. Even among the Catholic population, Henry's Protestant background was a barrier that required careful, deliberate negotiation to overcome. Henry's first years as King of France were dominated by this need to consolidate authority. Unlike a prince managing a small, secure territory, he now faced a kingdom divided by centuries of religious, political, and social tensions. His claim to the throne, though legally sound, faced practical challenges. The Catholic League controlled significant portions of northern France, supported by Spain, a foreign power that had its own interests in French politics. Meanwhile, Huguenot allies, who had once been his most reliable supporters, grew increasingly impatient with compromises and delays. Every decision Henry made had the potential to alienate one faction while appeasing another. He needed both strategy and patience in abundance. One of Henry's first acts as king was to employ a combination of diplomacy, incremental military campaigns, and strategic persuasion. He understood that outright confrontation would likely produce prolonged instability or even outright civil war. Instead, he worked to gradually bring rebellious territories under control, negotiating terms of surrender, offering local autonomy in exchange for loyalty, and carefully timing military campaigns to minimize bloodshed while maximizing political advantage. The process was slow and deliberate. Years of small victories, cautious compromise, and persistent, meticulous management of both allies and opponents. History often remembers kings for dramatic battles or sweeping reforms. But for Henry IV, the path to stability was defined by careful, almost bureaucratic attention to detail. It was during this period that Henry faced one of the most consequential decisions of his reign, whether to remain Protestant or convert to Catholicism. The question was not merely a matter of personal belief, it was a political calculation of the highest order. France was overwhelmingly Catholic, and his Protestant identity made it nearly impossible for him to secure the loyalty of the northern provinces or to gain acceptance in Paris, the political heart of the kingdom. Yet conversion carried its own risks, alienating his Huguenot supporters, appearing opportunistic, and setting a precedent for questions of religious fidelity in politics. Henry approached this decision with the same careful pragmatism that had guided his youth. He consulted advisors, weighed public opinion, and observed the shifting allegiances of both noble and common subjects. In 1593, after years of cautious negotiation, Henry publicly converted to Catholicism. His statement, "Paris is worth a mass," has become legendary, yet it was far more than a witty remark. It was the culmination of strategic thought honed over decades of observation and experience. By aligning himself with the dominant faith of France, Henry neutralized one of the most significant sources of opposition to his rule, allowing him to consolidate power in Paris and the surrounding regions. At the same time, he worked to reassure his former Protestant allies that their right would be protected, laying the groundwork for the Edict of Nantes 5 years later. The conversion was thus both a personal and a political act, emblematic of Henry's approach, careful, incremental, and always attuned to the practical realities of governance. While the religious question dominated attention, Henry's administration also tackled the mundane but crucial tasks of governance that determined the kingdom's stability. The treasury, drained by decades of war, required urgent reform. Tax collection, previously inconsistent and locally negotiated, needed to be standardized. Infrastructure had to be repaired, bridges, roads, and canals that facilitated trade were in disrepair, and urban centers were still recovering from the violence of the civil wars. Henry's approach was methodical. He implemented administrative reforms gradually, appointing trusted officials, overseeing budgets carefully, and establishing systems to ensure compliance across provinces. The work was tedious, slow, and largely invisible to the dramatic narrative of history, but it was essential for stabilizing a fractured nation. Even military campaigns during this period reflected Henry's reliance on careful calculation. Battles were fought when necessary, but he avoided reckless engagements that might destabilize regions or alienate key allies. He maintained disciplined, well-supplied forces, and he coordinated movement in concert with both political negotiation and local loyalties. Henry understood that outright victory on the battlefield did not guarantee political success. Legitimacy, loyalty, and social stability were equally crucial. In this sense, his reign illustrates a key principle of Bourbon governance. Power is maintained not merely by strength or charisma, but through patience, planning, and the careful management of multiple, interconnected systems. Henry's personal style also reflected these priorities. He cultivated personal relationships with nobles, envoys, and advisors, using charm, wit, and careful listening to understand motivations and anticipate challenges. He was approachable yet deliberate, personable but never reckless. Conversation. Each visit to a town or castle was an opportunity to observe, assess, and influence. It is easy to overlook these subtleties in traditional histories, yet they were central to Henry's consolidation of power. The Bourbon tradition of incremental, careful accumulation of advantage seen in centuries of land management, alliances, and bureaucratic competence manifested fully in these years of cautious kingship. As Henry stabilized his rule, he faced the ongoing challenge of balancing religious tolerance with political authority. The Edict of Nantes, issued in 1598, granted significant freedoms to the Huguenots, allowing them to worship openly in certain regions, maintain fortified towns, and participate in political life. It was, in many ways, an administrative masterpiece, balancing competing interests to achieve maximum stability. Yet it also required careful monitoring, enforcing the terms, ensuring that local officials complied, and managing resentment among Catholics who saw concessions to Protestants as excessive. Here again, Henry relied on the slow, careful work of governance, ensuring that policies were implemented incrementally rather than imposed abruptly. The result of these strategies was the remarkable stabilization of France after decades of internal chaos. Henry IV's careful balance of diplomacy, administration, military strategy, and personal negotiation transformed a fragmented and exhausted kingdom into a nation capable of recovery and growth. His reign illustrates how a ruler, guided by prudence and methodical attention to detail, can achieve extraordinary results not through sudden brilliance or dramatic gestures, but through persistent, incremental effort. The Bourbon Dynasty, with its centuries-long emphasis on careful accumulation of power and loyalty, had reached its full expression in a monarch who exemplified the same qualities on a national scale. And yet, as Henry's reign progressed, new questions began to emerge. Could the stability he had painstakingly constructed endure beyond his lifetime? Could the Bourbon Dynasty, strengthened through centuries of careful planning and prudent governance, maintain authority amid the ambitions, rivalries, and unforeseen crises that awaited in the decades ahead? The answers were not yet clear, leaving the dynasty poised between a foundation of careful preparation and the unpredictable currents of French history that would test even the most methodical rulers. Henry IV's transformation from a Protestant prince of Navarre into the Catholic king of France stands as one of the most instructive examples of political pragmatism in European history. It was a journey that combined careful preparation, personal adaptability, and an unflinching focus on practical governance. Unlike many historical narratives that celebrate dramatic moments, great battle, daring speeches, or heroic gestures. The story of Henry IV is defined by the patient accumulation of authority through strategy, patience, and meticulous attention to seemingly mundane matters. It is in these details, often overlooked, that the true skill of the king becomes apparent. By 1598, with the Edict of Nantes, Henry had accomplished what no previous ruler had managed. He brought relative peace to a kingdom exhausted by decades of religious civil war. The edict was not a sweeping idealistic decree. It was a finely tuned instrument of statecraft, carefully designed to balance competing interests. Catholics retained dominance, yet Protestants were granted legal protections and limited self-governance. The edict exemplifies Henry's governing style, pragmatic, incremental, and guided by a clear understanding of human and political reality. Through these measures, he stabilized the monarchy, secured the loyalty of diverse factions, and strengthened the Bourbon claim to the French throne. Henry's success also rested on his personal attributes, refined over decades of observation and careful negotiation. His charisma, humor, and charm allowed him to bridge divides that might have seemed insurmountable. Yet, these traits were not enough on their own. His skill lay in pairing personal diplomacy with the methodical administration inherited from his Bourbon ancestors. He maintained detailed oversight of finances, ensured the proper functioning of local governance, and carefully cultivated alliances, both domestic and international. He understood that the long-term durability of power depended on steady, often tedious management as much as on public displays of strength or brilliance. Even so, Henry's reign was not without challenges. Regional lords remained occasionally restless, and the economic damage from decades of civil war required constant attention. His own family, children, mistresses, and noble allies needed to be carefully managed to prevent internal conflict from undermining his authority. These pressures highlight a critical tension in Bourbon governance. Centuries of careful preparation had equipped Henry to navigate the complexities of a divided kingdom. Yet maintaining long-term stability required a continued, vigilant application of the same principles that had guided his rise. Authority was not simply seized, it had to be nurtured, adjusted, and constantly reinforced. Henry's legacy, however, is perhaps most visible in the continuity of the Bourbon dynasty itself. By securing the throne and stabilizing France, he created the conditions for his son, Louis XIII, and later grandson, Louis XIV, to inherit a monarchy strengthened by both tradition and practical governance. The slow, methodical work of generations of Bourbon's careful marriages, strategic alliance, and the maintenance of loyalty and territory found its culmination in Henry's reign. His life demonstrates that dynastic power is often less about sudden leaps of fortune and more about the persistent application of skill, judgment, and foresight over decades and even centuries. The quiet, procedural aspects of Henry's reign, administrative reforms, tax adjustments, infrastructure projects, and negotiation of religious tolerance reveal the underlying mechanics of statecraft that often go unnoticed in conventional histories. These efforts were not glamorous. They were repetitive, technical, and sometimes tedious. Yet without them, the Bourbon monarchy might have faltered under the weight of factionalism, rebellion, and financial strain. The dynasty's survival depended not on heroic action alone, but on the careful cultivation of competence, consistency, and foresight, the very qualities that had been refined over centuries in the regional strongholds of Bourbon. Yet, even with this success, the story leaves lingering questions about the sustainability of such methods. Henry IV's accomplishments highlight a crucial tension. Can a dynasty built on patience, prudence, and incremental improvement endure when confronted with sudden upheavals, personal flaws, or revolutionary ideas? While Henry's reign achieved relative peace and consolidation, the monarchy he stabilized would face enormous challenges in the following century, testing whether methodical governance could withstand the pressures of changing political, social, and economic realities. Reflecting on Henry IV, we see the paradox of leadership, the dramatic image of a king converting to Catholicism and uniting a divided country captures the imagination, but the reality was built on decades of careful preparation, observation, and incremental decision. The boring aspects of governance, estate management, negotiation of loyalty, oversight of taxes, and mediation of disputes were as crucial to France's stability as battlefield victories or public displays of authority. The success of Henry IV demonstrates that ordinary, methodical competence can shape extraordinary historical outcomes, even if the process itself appears dull or procedural at the time. Ultimately, Henry IV's life and reign illustrate the delicate interplay between personal skill and inherited strategy. He inherited a dynasty built on centuries of careful accumulation of power, and he applied those lessons on a national scale, navigating religion, politics, and human ambition with pragmatism and foresight. The Bourbon Dynasty, strengthened through generations of quiet diligence, reached a peak of influence under Henry's setting, the stage for the Sun King, Louis XIV, and the further evolution of France as a centralized, powerful state. And yet, the story leaves one final, reflective question. If Henry IV's methods relied so heavily on careful calculation, negotiation, attention to detail, how would future Bourbon kings, some less pragmatic, less disciplined, or more indulgent, maintain the stability he achieved? Could the techniques of survival and consolidation, so effective, a fractured 16th century France, withstand the pressures of absolutism, court intrigue, and eventually the revolutionary upheavals that would confront the Bourbon dynasty centuries later? The answer would unfold slowly, revealing the limits and resilience of a dynasty built on both patience and prudence. When we imagine the life of a Bourbon king, we often picture grand palaces, elaborate coronations, and the drama of court intrigue. Yet the everyday reality of kingship, especially in the early modern period, was dominated less by spectacle and more by routine, ritual, and the meticulous observance of etiquette. The daily life of a king was a carefully choreographed series of events designed to assert authority, reinforce hierarchy, and maintain the smooth functioning of a monarchy that depended as much on perception as on actual power. These routines, often repetitive and monotonous, were in many ways the backbone of Bourbon governance, ensuring that the king remained both visible and unassailable in a highly stratified society. Louis XIII, who reigned from 1610 to 1643, provides an illustrative example. Unlike his father, Henry IV, whose life was shaped by survival and pragmatism, Louis's daily existence revolved around strict ritual, etiquette, and formalized routines. From the moment he awoke, his day was dictated by custom and ceremony. The morning began with the lever, a highly structured ritual in which the king was attended by a carefully appointed group of courtiers, servants, and advisors. Each participant had a precise role, whether it was to assist the king in dressing, to offer prayers, or simply to witness the event, affirming the hierarchical structure of the court. These rituals, seemingly mundane, were deeply political. They displayed the king's power, reinforced the loyalty of attendants, and maintained a sense of order in a world where chaos could easily emerge from personal ambition or factional rivalry. Meals, too, were highly ritualized events. The king's breakfast, though modest by modern standards, was attended by specific courtiers who had earned the privilege of being present. Seating arrangements, the order of service, and even the timing of when dishes were presented were governed by strict rules. Each gesture, passing a plate, offering a cup of wine, or tasting a dish, carried symbolic weight. To violate etiquette, even inadvertently, was to risk social and political embarrassment. For a Bourbon king, mastery of these protocols was not merely about decorum, it was an essential tool for maintaining authority and demonstrating competence. The repetition of these daily routines created a predictable, orderly rhythm, reassuring both the king and his subjects that the monarchy was stable and in control. Louis XIII's day progressed through a series of public and private ceremonies designed to assert his authority and manage the machinery of the state. Audiences with ministers, ambassadors, and courtiers were conducted according to precise schedules and procedures. Each meeting reinforced the social hierarchy, with attendants required to follow strict protocols when entering and leaving the king's presence. Even decisions as mundane as granting permission for a minor appointment or approving a small land transfer were embedded in this ritualized framework, lending legitimacy to actions that, in isolation, might seem trivial. In this way, the daily routines of the king functioned as both administrative tools and instruments of power, linking ordinary governance to symbolic authority. Religious observance was another cornerstone of the Bourbon king's daily life. Louis XIII, like many of his predecessors, attended multiple masses each day, often in private chapels within the palace. These rituals were both spiritual and political, reinforcing the king's image as a pious ruler ordained by God. The intricacies of prayer, procession, and attendance were meticulously observed. Any deviation could be interpreted as disrespectful or politically significant. The repetition of these rituals, day after day, contributed to the broader perception of stability, demonstrating the king's constancy and reinforcing the moral legitimacy of his authority. Beyond ritual and ceremony, the king's life involved extensive engagement with administrative matters. Louis XIII, though often overshadowed by his ministers, spent hours reviewing correspondence, considering petitions, and supervising financial accounts. These tasks, though far less glamorous than a coronation or military campaign, were crucial for maintaining control over the kingdom. The bureaucratic apparatus of the Bourbon monarchy depended on careful oversight by the king, and even minor errors could cascade into serious problems for governance. Attention to such details reinforced the idea that the king was not merely a figurehead but an active participant in the ongoing management of the state. Even leisure and recreation were structured to serve political purposes. Hunting, for example, was both a pastime and a demonstration of power. A king's ability to command the court, organize larger-scale hunts, and display martial skill in these exercises reinforced his authority, both symbolically and practically. Music, dance, and games were not merely entertainment, they were opportunities to cultivate alliance, display refinement, and participate in the social rituals that bound the nobility to the crown. In every aspect of life, the king's routines served to intertwine personal activity with the maintenance of hierarchical order and political stability. The life of a Bourbon king was also shaped by isolation and surveillance. Courtiers were ever present, observing behavior, noting preferences, and reporting details to advisors. Privacy was limited, and personal decisions what to wear, how to eat, even where to walk in the palace gardens were subject to scrutiny. This constant observation reinforced the king's authority, ensuring that even mundane actions carried symbolic weight. It also created a form of social pressure that required careful self-regulation, teaching the king to move, speak, and act in ways that reinforced the dignity and power of the throne. In this context, even minor ceremonial mistakes could have outsized consequences. Arriving late to a meal, misplacing a document, or showing inappropriate familiarity with a noble could spark offense or resentment. Maintaining mastery over ritual, etiquette, and daily procedure was therefore an essential aspect of governance. Success in these areas allowed the king to cultivate loyalty, avoid disputes, and project an image of competence and control. The slow, repetitive work of attending to daily routines became, paradoxically, a critical instrument of national stability. Yet, despite the apparent monotony, these routines were not without subtle strategic purpose. The predictability of the king's day allowed courtiers to anticipate his movements, negotiate influence, and plan alliances, creating a dynamic interplay of observation and manipulation within the palace. The repetition of daily rituals reinforced authority while also providing space for the careful, often invisible negotiation of power. Over time, mastery of these patterns allowed the king to exercise influence far beyond the walls of the palace, extending control across provinces and shaping the social and political fabric of France. As the day progressed, the king's evening routines mirrored the morning in formality and purpose. The coucher, or ritual of retiring to bed, involved attendants who guided the king through dressing, prayers, and preparation for rest. Though seemingly banal, the coucher reinforced the king's centrality within the court hierarchy and provided opportunities for advisors to impart last-minute counsel or relay critical information. Every aspect of the day, from waking to sleeping, was infused with ritualized control, blending the personal, political, and symbolic into a continuous demonstration of authority. By examining these routines, one can see that the boring elements of royal life, meals, prayers, dressing, attending audiences, were in fact essential to the exercise of power. They provided a predictable framework in which both the king and his court operated, ensuring stability, reinforcing hierarchy, and creating opportunities for subtle influence. The quotidian rhythms of the Bourbon court reveal that monarchy was not merely a matter of grand decision or dramatic gestures, but of careful attention to the structure, timing, and symbolism of everyday life. And yet, as we observe the life of a Bourbon king in these details, a question emerges: could such meticulous, ritual-bound routine prepare a king to respond effectively to crises beyond the palace, rebellions, foreign threats, or unexpected political upheavals? The daily life of ritual and etiquette created stability and order, but could it also cultivate the decisiveness and adaptability necessary to govern a nation in times of true uncertainty? As the life of a Bourbon king unfolded beyond the morning rituals, the routines of midday and afternoon reveal the intricate balance between authority, governance, and social performance. For Louis XIII and other Bourbon monarchs, the palace was not just a home. It was a stage where every action reinforced hierarchy, showcased the king's dignity, and transmitted power through repetition and visibility. Beyond the ceremonial framework of the lever, meals, and prayer, the day was filled with subtler exercises of control, audiences with courtier, management of petitions, and oversight of bureaucratic operation, all designed to maintain the image of a capable and vigilant ruler. The midday session, often marked by lunch or a slightly more formal meal, served multiple purposes beyond sustenance. Attended by a select group of courtiers and advisors, this meal functioned as both a social and political arena. Seating arrangements were meticulously planned according to rank, favor, and influence. Courtiers paid careful attention to which dishes were offered, when they were served, and the gestures expected during each course. To the untrained observer, this might seem like mere etiquette or even fussy indulgence. Yet within this structured setting, loyalties were observed, alliances reinforced, and subtle hierarchies continually negotiated. A seemingly minor lapse, an incorrect gesture, an improperly timed toast, or a forgot protocol could send ripples through the court, signaling either favor or disapproval. After meals, much of the king's time was devoted to the management of petitions, letters, and official documents. Courtiers and ministers approached the king with requests for appointments, grants of land, or resolutions to legal disputes. Each petition required careful consideration. The king had to balance the interests of influential nobles, regional authority, and even commoners who had gained attention through petitions. Administrative oversight was tedious but essential. Errors or misjudgments could undermine authority, provoke resentment, or weaken loyalty in critical regions. The king's ability to process these requests effectively reflected not only his competence but also the strength of the Bourbon monarchy itself. Louis XIII also spent hours receiving ambassadors and foreign dignitaries. These audiences, while outwardly ceremonial, were central to statecraft. Protocol dictated every gesture, where visitors stood, how they approached the throne, and even how they bowed or curtsied. Behind these formalities, the king gauged intentions, assessed threats, and subtly influenced negotiation outcomes. Diplomacy, like daily meals, relied heavily on precision, repetition, and observation. A skilled monarch could read the attitudes of a visiting envoy through small cues, hesitation, posture, or tone. Every nuance was meaningful, and each interaction reinforced the king's stature, while preserving the careful balance between authority and diplomacy. Another critical aspect of the king's daily life was oversight of military and strategic matters. Even if the king did not personally lead armies, he remained involved in planning campaigns, reviewing troop movements, and coordinating logistics. Military correspondence often consumed hours of his day, and decisions about troop deployment were made with careful consideration of political, geographical, and social factors. The king's attention to these details was a continuation of the Bourbon tradition. Incremental, meticulous preparation ensured that even large-scale military operations were grounded in careful management rather than impulsive action. In this sense, the boring work of planning, correspondence, and oversight had profound consequences for national security and dynastic stability. Leisure activities, although more personal, were similarly infused with purpose. Hunting excursions, for instance, were more than recreation. They were displays of physical prowess, control over land, and mastery of social networks. The ability to organize and command hunts reflected the king's capacity to exercise authority over both people and territory. Music, dance, and entertainment, meanwhile, were carefully orchestrated, offering opportunity to cultivate influence, display refinement, and subtly negotiate court dynamics. Even seemingly trivial choices, what music to play, which courtiers to invite, or how to conduct a game, could carry political weight, shaping perceptions and reinforcing social order. Religious devotion remained central throughout the day. Beyond morning and evening prayers, the king attended daily masses or private devotions that reaffirmed his image as a pious and God-ordained ruler. Rituals of devotion were performed with precision. The arrangement of attendants, timing of prayers, and the gestures of reverence all adhered to strict protocols. This visible piety was not only personal, it was a form of political theater. In a kingdom still deeply shaped by religious identity, demonstrating faith reinforced legitimacy and helped manage tensions between competing factions. The careful repetition of devotional acts, integrated seamlessly into the day's schedule, reflected the Bourbon understanding of power as rooted in order, visibility, and consistency. One cannot overlook the ever-present role of observation in palace life. Courtiers and attendants monitored the king constantly, noting habits, preferences, and inconsistencies. This environment required the monarch to cultivate self-awareness, restraint, and adaptability. Every conversation, gesture, or expression was interpreted, often politically. To maintain authority, the king had to anticipate reactions, manage perceptions, and exercise discretion at all times. In this sense, the routines of the day, dressing, eating, walking in gardens, or attending meetings, function as tools for governance, blending the personal and political in a continuous demonstration of control. The palace itself acted as a living symbol of Bourbon authority. Its architecture, arrangement of rooms, and spatial hierarchies reinforced the centrality of the king. The layout of corridors, chambers, and ceremonial spaces dictated the flow of interactions, ensuring that courtiers and visitors moved through the palace according to established patterns. In this environment, the repetitive rituals of the day, meals, audiences, prayers were amplified, creating a sense of continuity and reinforcing the king's central position in both the physical and social structure of the monarchy. By observing these routines in their entirety, one can appreciate the subtle genius of Bourbon kingship. Authority was maintained not through occasional acts of brilliance, but through continuous, disciplined attention to mundane details. Every ritual, gesture, and action contributed to a broader framework of power. The daily life of a Bourbon king demonstrates that the endurance of monarchy depended as much on repetition, structure, and predictability as on battlefield victories or legislative reforms. These small, often overlooked moments formed the bedrock of dynastic stability, ensuring that the king's authority remained visible, legitimate, and respected across the realm. Yet, as the day drew to an end and the coucher ritual prepared the king for rest, one question persisted. Could a life so structured, so dependent on repetition and observation, equip a monarch to face sudden crises, rebellions, or unexpected challenges beyond the palace walls? Routine created stability and predictability, but it also demanded adaptability in moments of true uncertainty, a tension that would define the successes and failures of Bourbon kings for generations to come. As evening fell within the gilded halls of the Bourbon palace, the day's ritual drew to a close, yet their significance extended far beyond mere routine. The coucher, the carefully orchestrated ritual in which the king retired to bed, was the final affirmation of hierarchical order and royal authority. Attendants guided the king through dressing, prayers, and the final administration of his household, each gesture reinforcing the invisible web of loyalty and social structure that maintained the monarchy. These seemingly banal routines, the precise arrangement of candles, the positioning of courtiers, the timing of prayers, were not ceremonial niceties. They were essential mechanisms by which the Bourbon kings exerted control over both people and perception. The life of a Bourbon monarch demonstrates a central truth of early modern governance. Stability and authority were rarely products of singular, dramatic events. Instead, they emerged from repetition, careful observation, and meticulous management of social rituals. Every meal, audience, prayer, or game reinforced hierarchy, communicated legitimacy, and subtly trained the court in the expectations of loyalty. This slow, deliberate construction of authority contrasts sharply with the modern image of kings as dramatic, heroic figures, highlighting the boring yet historically crucial dimensions of rulership. A king's power, in practice, was deeply embedded in the rhythm of daily life. Meals, which might appear trivial, exemplify this principle. Each dish presented, every gesture performed, and the sequence of service communicated both rank and favor. Courtiers could interpret seating arrangements, who served the king, and even the way food was handled as indicators of influence. Through these daily interactions, the king reinforced his centrality, demonstrating that authority depended not just on edicts or armies, but on social and symbolic mastery. Ritualized dining also created structured opportunities for negotiation, observation, and subtle influence, a reminder that even the simplest acts were entwined with the broader mechanisms of power. Religious observance remained another critical pillar of Bourbon daily life. Attendance at multiple masses, private prayers, and participation in chapel rituals were not merely expressions of personal faith. They functioned as political instruments, legitimizing the monarchy in the eyes of subjects and noble factions alike. Repetition of these rituals reinforced the king's image as divinely sanctioned, creating continuity in a world where instability was always a threat. In essence, prayer became governance, a visible and consistent demonstration that the king was both morally and politically anchored. The daily rhythm of audiences, petitions, and correspondence further underscores the subtle genius of Bourbon administration. Each interaction, no matter how minor, required careful judgment and timing. Courtiers presented requests with an awareness of hierarchy and protocol, while the king assessed each petition not only for its immediate merits but also for its broader implications for loyalty, influence, and political stability. Administrative competence, attention to detail, and careful observation qualities honed in the earlier generation of Bourbon lords proved essential for maintaining control over a complex and hierarchical society. Through these routines, the king's authority was continuously reinforced, exercised, not through spectacle alone, but through the careful orchestration of everyday governance. Even leisure was political. Hunting, music, and dance served as arenas for demonstrating skill, asserting authority, and cultivating relationships. A well-conducted hunt displayed command over both terrain and people. Music and dance, orchestrated with precision, reinforced social hierarchies and cultivated favor. The king's participation in these activities required constant awareness of perception. Each gesture could be interpreted as favor, disdain, or neutrality. Through repetition and attention, the king trained the court to recognize and respect the boundaries of power, embedding authority in the routines of everyday life. Yet, while daily rituals created order and predictability, they also demanded constant vigilance and adaptability. Courtiers watched for inconsistencies. Minor lapses could signal weakness or provoke challenges. Authority depended on performance as much as on legitimacy, requiring king to navigate a delicate balance between routine and responsiveness. The very stability achieved through repetition carried the risk of rigidity. A monarch who could not adjust when the unexpected occurred might see the carefully constructed web of loyalty unravel. In this tension between stability and adaptability lies one of the central challenges of Bourbon kingship. The life of a Bourbon king also illuminates the invisible labor of governance. The hours spent reviewing accounts correspond with officials across the realm, and overseeing the machinery of state were as decisive as any battlefield victory. By embedding authority in routine, the king ensured that power was continuous, visible, and reinforced daily. The boring work, far from being trivial, created the conditions for extraordinary outcomes, sustaining dynastic stability and consolidating the monarchy in a way that would influence France for centuries. And yet, the story of these routines leaves us with a reflective question. Could the meticulous orchestration of daily life equip a king to face crises that fell outside the predictable patterns of palace ritual? Stability depended on repetition and observation, but the unpredictability of rebellion, foreign threat, or court intrigue demanded flexibility, intuition, and decisiveness. The balance between routine and adaptability would determine the success of the Bourbon dynasty in the turbulent decades that followed. Ultimately, the daily life of a Bourbon king teaches us that history often turns on what seems mundane. Authority, influence, and stability were built in the repetition of small acts, the careful management of rituals, and the subtle negotiation of relationships. These boring elements, meals, prayers, dressing, audiences, and even leisure, formed the invisible scaffolding upon which dynasties depended. In the quiet rhythm of daily life, the Bourbon monarchy maintained its power, demonstrating that history is as much about the ordinary and procedural as it is about drama, battles, and grand events. Louis XIV, the Sun King, is often remembered for his dazzling court at Versailles, his extravagant lifestyle, and his image as the epitome of absolute monarchy. Yet behind the grandeur lay a carefully constructed system of governance, a network of routine, rituals, and administrative techniques designed to centralize power in the hands of the king. Understanding the mechanics of Louis XIV's rule requires examining the seemingly mundane, bureaucratic, and procedural aspects of his reign, the details that historians sometimes overlook but which were critical to consolidating and maintaining royal authority over a vast and diverse kingdom. Louis XIV ascended the throne in 1643 at the age of 4, following the death of his father, Louis XIII. During his early years, real authority rested with his mother, Anne of Austria, and her chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. The young king's upbringing was meticulously planned, with education emphasizing not only classical studies, religious instruction, but also the observation of political maneuvering and courtly procedure. From an early age, Louis was taught that power required both visibility and precision. He watched how ministers negotiated, how ceremonies were conducted, and how even minor gestures could signal favor or disfavor. These lessons, absorbed quietly over years of observation, laid the foundation for his later mastery of centralized authority. One of the most critical strategies Louis XIV employed to consolidate power was the careful management of the nobility. France's nobles had long exercised significant influence over politics, military campaigns, and regional governance. They controlled land, commanded troops, and maintained local networks of loyalty. To centralize power, Louis needed to reduce the political independence of these nobles without provoking open rebellion. His solution was subtle, methodical, and rooted in the regulation of daily life. By inviting nobles to reside at Versailles, he made them dependent on the court for status, visibility, and influence. Living at Versailles required adherence to strict schedules, participation in rituals, and observance of detailed codes of etiquette. These routines, while seemingly ceremonial, served to transform political leverage into social dependence, ensuring that nobles were invested in the king's favor rather than regional autonomy. The daily life of Louis XIV of Versailles illustrates the meticulous orchestration that underpinned absolute monarchy. Each day was carefully structured around rituals that reinforced hierarchy and visibility. The lever and coucher rituals, inherited and refined from earlier Bourbon practice, became elaborate performances in which courtiers observed and participated in the king's routine. Attendance at these events was a privilege that could only be earned through loyalty and careful navigation of court hierarchy. The repetition of these rituals was not merely ceremonial, it was an instrument of control. By dictating who could approach him, when, and under what circumstances, Louis centralized authority symbolically and practically. Administrative centralization was another cornerstone of Louis XIV's rule. The king reduced the influence of traditional local parliaments and garners by establishing a system in which royal officials, known as intendants, supervised provincial administration on his behalf. These officials reported directly to the crown, bypassing local nobles, and ensured consistent enforcement of royal edicts, taxes, and justice. The network of intendants required oversight, correspondence, and evaluation a continuous bureaucratic exercise that reinforced the king's presence in every corner of France. Although the process was slow and often repetitive, it allowed Louis to exercise control over distant regions without relying on the inconsistent loyalty of local lords. Finance, too, demanded constant attention. France's economy was complex, fragmented, and prone to instability. Wars, infrastructure projects, and court extravagance placed enormous strain on the treasury. Louis XIV relied on skilled ministers, such as Jean-Baptiste Colbert, to manage taxation, trade, and fiscal policy. Yet even the best policies required meticulous monitoring. Collection of taxes had to be precise, local officials supervised, and financial flows tracked continuously. These administrative routines, though tedious and invisible to the public, were essential for sustaining the machinery of monarchy. Without disciplined oversight, both authority and state stability could quickly erode. Military organization exemplifies the combination of routine and centralization. Louis XIV maintained a standing army far larger and more disciplined than previous French forces. This required careful management of recruitment, training, provisioning, and deployment. Military orders flowed through a bureaucratic hierarchy, allowing the king to direct operations without relying solely on the independent initiative of noble commanders. Again, the boring work of administration, record-keeping, logistics, and oversight proved decisive. By systematizing authority, Louis could wage campaigns that projected royal power across Europe while maintaining domestic control. Even culture and leisure were harnessed to reinforce authority. Louis XIV understood the power of spectacle. Music, theater, ceremonies, and public displays were carefully timed and choreographed to communicate dominance, order, and prestige. Yet these were not spontaneous events. They involved weeks of planning, coordination, and attention to minute detail. The selection of performers, the timing of performances, the seating of courtiers, and the sequence of events were all calculated to reinforce hierarchy and control. In this sense, the king's cultural activities were extensions of administrative governance, tools for shaping perception, signaling priorities, and maintaining loyalty. Religious observance continued to serve a dual role. Louis XIV was acutely aware that faith was intertwined with legitimacy. Daily mass, elaborate religious ceremonies, and public displays of piety reinforced the image of a divinely sanctioned ruler. Religious rituals were also carefully choreographed, with precise positioning of attendees, gestures, and timing. These practices maintained moral authority and helped manage factions within a deeply Catholic society, integrating spiritual legitimacy with political control. Through these layers of daily management, ritual, and administration, Louis XIV achieved the centralization of power that defines his reign. Authority was no longer dispersed among independent nobles, regional governors, or factions. It was concentrated in the figure of the king, maintained through disciplined routines, bureaucratic oversight, and visible social hierarchy. The mechanisms of monarchy were embedded in daily life, demonstrating that absolute power was constructed as much through repetition and procedure as through decrees or conquest. Yet, even as these systems consolidated power, a central question remained. Could a monarchy so dependent on rigid routines, meticulous observation, and controlled visibility adapt to sudden crisis, rebellions, economic shocks, or external threats without unraveling? The very structures that ensured stability also risked rigidity, creating both strength and vulnerability for the Sun King. and the dynasty he embodied. As Louis XIV matured and assumed personal control of the French crown in 1661 following the death of Cardinal Mazarin, the meticulous systems of governance he had observed and practiced in his youth came fully into effect. The young king had internalized lessons about visibility, ceremony, and hierarchy, transforming them into instruments of absolute authority. Yet these mechanisms, while highly effective, required constant attention, repetition, and precision to function. The centralization of power was not a single achievement, it was a daily, iterative process that intertwined ritual, administration, and personal oversight. One of the most striking aspects of Louis XIV's rule was the orchestration of Versailles as both a residence and a tool of governance. The palace was designed not merely for comfort or display, but as a living instrument of control. Every corridor, chamber, and courtyard was constructed to regulate movement, visibility, and interaction. Courtiers were carefully assigned living quarters, schedules, and responsibilities that bound them to the king's presence and whims. The spatial arrangement ensured that proximity to the king conveyed prestige, while absence risked obscurity. By transforming residence into a system of social hierarchy, Louis could govern behavior as effectively as he governed territory. The daily rhythm at Versailles exemplified the subtle, yet pervasive centralization of authority. The lever and coucher, originally inherited from his Bourbon predecessors, became elaborate performances in which courtiers participated according to rank, favor, and seniority. Even the smallest gestures, how one knelt, how one addressed the king, or where one placed a hand during a meal, were regulated by explicit rules. These routines were tedious, repetitive, and highly structured, yet they allowed the king to communicate power silently, reinforcing his preeminence while training the court to observe, defer, and internalize hierarchical norms. In this way, authority was exercised not only through decree, but through daily social choreography. Administrative centralization extended beyond Versailles. Louis XIV strengthened the role of intendants, royal officials tasked with supervising provinces on the crown's behalf. These officials were responsible for justice, taxation, and public order, ensuring consistent enforcement of royal authority across France. The king maintained oversight through regular correspondence, inspections, and report, while the tasks themselves, reviewing documents, evaluating officials, approving budgets, were repetitive and bureaucratic. They were crucial to maintaining control over a kingdom with significant geographic and social diversity. The combination of visibility at court and invisible oversight in the province allowed Louis to consolidate authority in ways that predecessors could not. Finance remained a central concern. Wars, construction projects, and the lavish life of Versailles placed enormous strain on the treasury. Louis XIV relied on ministers like Jean-Baptiste Colbert to systematize taxation, regulate trade, and improve economic efficiency. Yet, even the most skilled ministers could not operate independently. The king monitored every decision, every report, and every fiscal calculation. Bureaucratic oversight, though slow and repetitive, ensured that revenue collection aligned with strategic priorities, preventing local officials from acting autonomously and reinforcing centralized control. The boring minutiae of accounting, auditing, and regulation were in fact central to sustaining both the monarchy and its ambitious projects. Louis XIV's approach to military power was similarly structured and deliberate. He maintained a standing army unprecedented in size and discipline, requiring careful administration of recruitment, provisioning, and command. Campaigns were planned with logistical precision, ensuring that troops were available, supplied, and strategically positioned. Unlike earlier monarchs who relied heavily on the initiative of independent noble commanders, Louis centralized authority through bureaucracy, establishing direct lines of communication and oversight. The king's daily attention to military matters, reviewing reports, evaluating strategies, and coordinating orders, reflected the same combination of discipline and observation that characterized other areas of governance. Even culture, entertainment, and public spectacle were harnessed to reinforce authority. Louis XIV understood that control over perception was as important as control over territory. The palace's theaters, music performances, and public ceremonies were choreographed with military-like precision, designed to signal order, hierarchy, and the king's centrality. Attendance, timing, seating, and participation were all dictated with meticulous care. While these events appear extravagant, they functioned as a form of governance. By structuring behavior and expectation, the king ensured loyalty, maintained social order, and reinforced the perception of inviolable authority. Religion continued to play a dual role. Daily masses, elaborate festivals, and devotional rituals integrated the king's personal piety with public political messaging. By visibly participating in religious practice, Louis reinforced both legitimacy and moral authority. The coordination of these events required careful planning, placement of clergy, sequencing of ritual acts, and timing were all orchestrated to communicate divine sanction and centralized control. The repetition and predictability of religious observance mirrored the routines of governance, reinforcing the king's omnipresence in both spiritual and political realms. Yet, despite these meticulously engineered systems, the centralized monarchy carried inherent tensions. By concentrating power, Louis XIV created a kingdom that relied heavily on his personal oversight and presence. Success demanded constant vigilance. Any lapse in attention could destabilize courtly hierarchy, administrative control, or provincial loyalty. Moreover, the rigidity required to enforce routine and ritual sometimes limited flexibility, leaving the monarchy potentially vulnerable to sudden crises that did not fit within the established structure. The very practices that ensured stability, ritual, bureaucracy, and observation could also become constrained, highlighting the delicate balance between order and adaptability that defined absolute monarchy. Louis XIV's consolidation of power also demonstrates the relationship between visibility and authority. By making his presence central to every aspect of court and governance, he created a system in which loyalty, hierarchy, and obedience were continuously reinforced. Courtiers internalized norms and expectations. Provincial officials understood that their actions were scrutinized, and subjects, aware of the king's pervasive reach, recognized the centrality of royal authority. The boring elements of daily life rituals, bureaucratic oversight, correspondence, and repetitive administration were, in reality, powerful tools of statecraft, creating the conditions for one of the most enduringly centralized monarchies in European history. And yet, as these systems matured and reached their peak, a question remained. Could the centralization of authority under a single individual survive beyond the lifespan of a monarch so disciplined and attentive? The strength of the system rested heavily on personal oversight, ritual, and meticulous management qualities not guaranteed in successors. Would future kings, courtiers, or officials maintain the delicate balance between ritual, bureaucracy, and practical governance, or would the very structures designed to consolidate power sow the seeds of rigidity and decline? This unresolved tension would haunt the Bourbon monarchy for generations, demonstrating that even the most methodically engineered systems of authority are vulnerable to the unpredictable forces of history. As Louis XIV approached the midpoint of his reign, the structure of power he had meticulously constructed reached their full expression. Versailles stood as the tangible embodiment of absolute monarchy, a palace designed to centralize authority, orchestrate visibility, and regulate every interaction among nobles and officials. Daily routines, ceremonies, and administrative oversight ensured that the king's authority permeated every corner of the kingdom, reinforcing the perception of unassailable dominance. Yet behind the grandeur and spectacle lay a series of repetitive, boring, and painstakingly detailed practices that were, in reality, the backbone of his rule. The daily life of the Sun King, his lever and coucher, meals, audiences, religious observances, and oversight of ministers demonstrates the central principle of Bourbon power. Authority is maintained not solely by dramatic acts or military conquest, but through consistent, disciplined management of rituals, relationships, and bureaucracy. The repetitive nature of these routines was critical. By embedding power into daily life, Louis ensured that his presence, even symbolically, was inescapable. Courtiers, ministers, and provincial officials were trained to operate within a system that made the king both omnipresent and indispensable. Hierarchies were reinforced not only through law or decree, but through the mundane, repetitive, and meticulously observed rituals that structured every moment of life at court. Administrative centralization was equally crucial. The network of intendants, ministers, and advisors allowed the king to extend control across the kingdom without relying solely on the traditional nobility, who had long held independent power. Taxes were collected efficiently, justice was supervised, and local officials were accountable to the crown rather than regional strongmen. While the mechanics of bureaucracy may seem dull letters written, accounts audited, orders sent, they were fundamental to sustaining the Sun King's ambition. Without this meticulous attention to detail, the kingdom could not have supported the extravagant court, the military campaigns, or the infrastructure projects that defined Louis XIV's reign. The boring work of administration was, in essence, a form of absolute power, as critical as any battlefield victory. Even military campaigns, which often capture historical attention, relied heavily on these mundane elements. Logistics, provisioning, troop rotation, and recruitment were conducted through strict bureaucratic oversight. The king's involvement in monitoring reports, evaluating strategies, and coordinating generals was essential. Success on the battlefield was as much a product of disciplined administration and planning as of courage or tactics. Here again, repetition, observation, and attention to detail proved decisive, demonstrated that the mechanics of power extended far beyond visible displays of might. Cultural and religious rituals also reinforced centralization. Daily attendance at mass, participation in festivals, and orchestration of performance at Versailles served as constant reminders of the king's supremacy. Each gesture, positioning, and timing was meticulously planned to communicate hierarchy and consolidate loyalty. In this sense, the performative aspects of Louis XIV's reign, music, theatre, dance, and public spectacle were instruments of governance, entwining social life, politics, and authority into a cohesive system that made the monarchy not only dominant but unavoidable in everyday life. Yet this very system carried inherent vulnerabilities. The centralization of authority made the monarchy heavily dependent on the personal discipline, energy, and oversight of the king himself. The intricate routines and bureaucratic oversight that ensured stability also created rigidity, leaving the system potentially fragile if successors lacked the same commitment to meticulous management. Authority, deeply embedded in ritual, routine, and observation, risked being undermined if attention faltered or ambition strayed. The very mechanisms that produced stability also introduced constraints that demanded constant care and vigilance. Louis XIV's reign ultimately illustrates the paradox of absolute monarchy. Power is at once visible and invisible, dramatic and mundane, extraordinary and deeply procedural. The grandeur of Versailles, the disciplined hierarchy of courtiers, the oversight of administrative and military affairs all depended on small, repetitive, and often tedious acts of governance. Meals, letters, prayer, audiences, and rituals were not trivial. They were the instruments through which the king exercised absolute control. The boring aspects of daily life were, paradoxically, the most crucial in sustaining dynastic authority. By the end of his reign, Louis XIV had created a monarchy that projected stability, order, and omnipresence. The Bourbon Dynasty, strengthened through centuries of careful management, had reached a pinnacle of centralized power. Yet the question that lingered beyond Versailles, beyond the polished ceremonies and meticulously maintained routines, was whether this system could survive without the guiding hand of the Sun King himself. Would the carefully orchestrated mechanisms of authority endure when faced with the unpredictability of human ambition, political intrigue, or societal change? Could the Bourbon dynasty maintain its carefully constructed stability beyond the reign of a monarch who embodied discipline, observation, and meticulous management to an extraordinary degree? The story of Louis XIV's centralization of power is a testament to the extraordinary impact of the ordinary. History often celebrates kings for battles won, treaties signed, or grandiose constructions. Yet the real power of the Sun King lay in the repetitive, procedural, and detailed work that sustained authority day by day. In the boring rhythms of governance, ritual, and administration, we see the true mechanics of absolute monarchy, a system that depended as much on consistency, observation, and meticulous attention to detail as on ambition, charisma, or vision. The legacy of Louis XIV reminds us that the durability of power is often forged in the repetitive and mundane, quietly shaping history in ways that are rarely dramatic but profoundly enduring. In the complex machinery of Bourbon France, kings were not the sole architects of policy or the only executors of authority. Behind the grandeur of palaces, the spectacle of court life, and the public performance of power, there existed an extensive network of ministers, advisors, and bureaucrats whose work ensured that the monarchy functioned smoothly. These figures, often overlooked in popular narratives, were the backbone of governance, translating royal ambition into practical outcomes. Their labor was painstaking, procedural, and sometimes monotonous, but without it, the monarchy would have been little more than a symbolic figurehead. The rise of powerful ministers under the Bourbon dynasty reflects the growing complexity of the French state. By the 17th century, monarchs like Louis XIII and Louis XIV confronted challenges that required more than personal charisma or military skill. Maintaining authority across a geographically expansive and socially diverse kingdom demanded coordination, communication, and expertise in finance, justice, and administration. Ministers became essential intermediaries, bridging the gap between the king and provincial governors, local officials, and the population at large. Their role was simultaneously political, bureaucratic, and often invisible. They shaped policy, executed laws, and maintained the daily operations of the state without the pomp or ceremony of the throne. Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister of Louis XIII, offers a striking example of the power and influence that ministers could wield. Appointed in 1624, Richelieu's career demonstrates that the effectiveness of governance often depended on the methodical application of knowledge, observation, and incremental action. He reorganized administration, strengthened royal authority, and worked to subordinate rebellious nobles, all while navigating the intricate networks of courtly politics. Richelieu's genius lay not in dramatic gestures but in consistent, disciplined application of bureaucratic and political strategies. Each edict he issued, each appointment he made, and each administrative reform he oversaw was part of a carefully coordinated effort to consolidate central power. Richelieu also recognized the importance of oversight. Provincial governors, previously accustomed to exercising considerable autonomy, were increasingly supervised by royal officials called intendants. These bureaucrats were tasked with implementing royal policy, collecting taxes, administering justice, and monitoring local nobility. Intendants reported directly to the crown, bypassing traditional regional power structures. This system required extensive coordination, careful record-keeping, and constant communication. Repetitive and often tedious work that was essential for centralization. Without the diligence of these administrators, royal authority would have been fragmented, leaving the monarchy vulnerable to local resistance or corruption. Financial management was another critical area in which ministers exerted influence. Taxation, trade regulation, and fiscal oversight were complex tasks in a kingdom still recovering from civil war, religious conflict, and fluctuating economic conditions. Ministers like Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who served under Louis XIV, approached these responsibilities with meticulous attention to detail. Colbert's reforms included standardizing tax collection, improving infrastructure, encouraging commerce, and regulating guilds. Each measure required careful planning, monitoring, and adaptation to local conditions. The work was repetitive, procedural, and far from glamorous. Yet it directly underpinned the monarchy's capacity to fund wars, maintain Versailles, and project authority throughout France. The bureaucratic structure created by ministers also shaped political culture. By professionalizing administration and emphasizing competence, ministers established a system in which authority was exercised through knowledge, documentation, and careful procedure rather than through force alone. Courtiers, provincial officials, and local magistrates were bound to the system by expectation and habit, while the king retained ultimate control. The interplay between ministers and the monarchy highlights the cooperative, sometimes tense, relationship between personal power and institutional authority. Ministers expanded the reach of the crown, yet they operated within a framework carefully designed to prevent them from eclipsing the king. Even seemingly minor offices played a crucial role in the governance of France. Clerks, record keepers, and low-level bureaucrats managed correspondence, legal documentation, and the flow of information. Their repetitive work drafting letters, maintaining ledgers, and filing petitions was far from visible to the public, yet it enabled the functioning of the larger machinery of state. The smooth operation of provincial administration, taxation, and legal processes relied on this boring but indispensable labor. In many ways, the efficiency of the monarchy depended on the fidelity and diligence of these often anonymous officials. The coordination of military operations also fell heavily on ministers and bureaucrats. Wars required careful oversight of troop recruitment, provisioning, payment, and deployment. Ministers ensured that generals received orders, supplies were delivered, and strategy aligned with royal policy. Without this systematic administration, even a large, disciplined army could falter. As with taxation and provincial governance, the effectiveness of military campaigns rested on the repetitive, detail-oriented work of bureaucrats translating royal authority into practical outcomes. Religion, too, was managed through the ministerial apparatus. Church appointments, regulation of clergy, and supervision of religious institutions were tightly coordinated with state interests. Ministers ensured that the king's policies aligned with religious objectives, balancing the need to maintain Catholic orthodoxy with the practical demands of governance. Religious oversight was procedural and bureaucratic, but it reinforced the legitimacy of the monarchy and maintained social cohesion, a subtle but vital aspect of Bourbon administration. The labor of ministers and bureaucrats also illustrates the tension between visibility and invisibility in governance. While the king remained the visible center of authority, the actual functioning of the state depended on countless acts of diligence behind the scenes. Policies were shaped in council meetings, letters were drafted, reports were analyzed, and decisions were implemented far from the ceremonial center of Versailles. The monarchy depended on this interplay. The king projected power publicly while ministers and bureaucrats ensured that the machinery of state operated reliably day after day. Yet the dependence on ministers and bureaucrats also introduced vulnerabilities. The monarchy relied on the competence, loyalty, and diligence of these officials. Mistakes, corruption, or personal ambition could undermine policies, disrupt tax collection, or weaken provincial oversight. The repetitive and procedural nature of ministerial work, while essential for centralization, required careful supervision. Success depended on a combination of institutional design, personal oversight, and the careful selection of capable officials, a balance that defined the stability of the Bourbon state. The story of ministers and bureaucrats in Bourbon France underscores an important historical truth. The durability of monarchy often rests not on dramatic acts of power or public spectacle, but on the discipline, repetitive labor of those who translate authority into practical governance. These figures may be boring in the sense that their work is procedural, tedious, and invisible to contemporaries and posterity alike, yet without them, the monarchy's authority, stability, and reach would have been severely compromised. The network of ministers and bureaucrats demonstrates that history is as much about ordinary, detailed, and methodical work as it is about battles, speeches, or extravagant ceremonies. And yet, even with these structures in place, a question remains: could the monarchy, so dependent on the diligence of ministers and bureaucrats, survive when faced with crises beyond routine administration, rebellions, sudden wars, or economic collapse? How resilient was this system when the boring routines of daily governance were suddenly challenged by extraordinary events? The answer would reveal the limits and strengths of Bourbon bureaucracy in shaping the history of France. The effectiveness of Bourbon governance depended not only on the authority of ministers but also on the intricate networks of communication, oversight, and procedure that connected them to the king. Louis XIV, having observed the power of ministers in his youth under Cardinal Mazarin, understood that a strong bureaucracy was both a tool and a potential challenge. He relied on capable administrators to extend his authority, yet he meticulously ensured that no minister could eclipse the king's supremacy. This balance between delegation and centralized control was maintained through constant observation, structured routines, and careful oversight. One example of this delicate balance can be seen in the role of Colbert, Louis XIV's finance minister. Colbert was responsible for managing the kingdom's complex fiscal apparatus, overseeing taxation, trade, and economic regulation. His work required repeated attention to detail, auditing accounts, inspecting provincial tax offices, negotiating with guilds, and reviewing the flow of goods and money. These tasks were far from glamorous, yet they were essential to the monarchy's stability. Colbert's success depended on the king's confidence, but also on a systematic framework of reporting and documentation. Each report, ledger, and memorandum reinforced the hierarchical structure of governance, ensuring that decisions aligned with royal priorities. The bureaucratic network also extended deeply into provincial administration. Intendants, royal officials stationed across France, acted as the king's eyes and ears. They were responsible for enforcing policy, supervising local officials, collecting taxes, and maintaining order. The intendant system minimized the influence of potentially rebellious nobles, creating a direct line of authority between the king and his subjects. Reports from intendants flowed back to Versailles with regularity, often through multiple layers of written correspondence, detailing issues from minor civil disputes to larger regional concerns. These repeated procedural communications may seem mundane, yet they formed the foundation of centralized power, ensuring that royal decrees were implemented uniformly and that the monarchy remained visible across the kingdom. Legal administration also exemplified the importance of ministerial labor. France's courts, parliaments, and local magistrates operated under the oversight of the crown, but the details of enforcement required constant coordination. Ministers reviewed cases, issued instructions, and supervised local officials to ensure that justice aligned with royal priorities. Routine correspondence, case monitoring, and administrative decisions reinforced the legitimacy of the monarchy, demonstrating that law and authority flowed from the king through a disciplined, bureaucratic structure. The repetitive and meticulous nature of this work was critical. Even small errors or lapses in oversight could erode trust, provoke disputes, or encourage resistance among local elites. Military administration, too, relied heavily on ministers and bureaucrats. Organizing armies involved more than generals and troops. It required precise coordination of supplies, pay, recruitment, and strategic planning. Ministers oversaw the logistical machinery that ensured troops could be mobilized efficiently and campaigns could proceed without disruption. Written reports, detailed orders, and systematic inspections were integral to this process. The boring work of administration tracking provisions, reviewing troop movements, and maintaining records enabled France to project power beyond its borders and maintain domestic stability simultaneously. Without such meticulous oversight, even a large and disciplined army could falter. The ministry also shaped cultural and religious life, aligning institutions with royal priorities. Church appointments, educational institutions, and religious observances were carefully coordinated to support both governance and the king's legitimacy. Ministers ensured that clergy adhered to orthodoxy, that rituals reinforced hierarchy, and that education fostered loyalty to the crown. These responsibilities may appear dull, yet they were crucial for maintaining social cohesion and consolidating authority. Through the repetitive work of monitoring, planning, and reporting, ministers connect everyday social and religious life to the central power of the monarchy. One of the subtle but powerful aspects of ministerial work was its role in information management. In an era before telegraphs, telephones, or modern communication systems, the accurate and timely flow of information was vital. Ministers recorded, summarized, and transmitted details from across France, providing the king with a constant understanding of his realm. This reliance on repetitive procedures, letter writing, ledger keeping, and report analysis enabled the monarch to exercise authority over regions he could never personally visit. The efficiency of this system relied entirely on the diligence and competence of bureaucrats, highlighting the invisible but indispensable labor behind royal power. The interplay between ministers and the king also shaped decision-making. While ministers prepared analysis, proposed reforms, and managed routine governance, the king exercised judgment, discretion, and final approval. Daily audiences with ministers were a combination of ritual and oversight. The king evaluated reports, questioned officials, and ensured alignment with his vision. This constant interaction, repetitive and meticulous in nature, created a feedback loop in which administrative labor reinforced centralized authority while providing the monarch with the information necessary for strategic decision-making. However, the reliance on ministers introduced inherent risks. Excessive delegation could allow ambition, negligence, or corruption to undermine royal authority. A minister who overstepped or manipulated information could threaten the carefully calibrated balance of power. Louis XIV mitigated this risk through careful observation, frequent meeting, and the cultivation of loyalty through rewards, favors, and visibility. The structured routines of daily administration, audiences, correspondence review, inspections functioned not only to manage state business, but also to maintain control over those entrusted with it. The labor of ministers and bureaucrats also demonstrates a broader principle. The durability of governance depends on ordinary, methodical work. Grand palaces, armies, and ceremonial displays were visible symbols of power, but the invisible, repetitive acts of administration ensured that authority was practical, enforceable, and enduring. The boring routines of paperwork, oversight, and monitoring underpinned the grandeur of Bourbon France, providing the scaffolding for both domestic control and international influence. Yet, despite these well-structured systems, the question of resilience remained. Could a monarchy so dependent on the fidelity and competence of ministers and bureaucrats withstand unexpected crises, such as rebellion, famine, or sudden military threat? The effectiveness of administration relied on repetition, precision, and oversight, qualities that might falter under extreme pressure. The tension between routine governance and extraordinary circumstance would test the limits of Bourbon bureaucracy, revealing both its strengths and its vulnerabilities in shaping the trajectory of French history. By the later years of Louis XIV's reign, the system of ministers and bureaucrats had become an indispensable part of the monarchy. These officials, ranging from high-ranking ministers like Colbert and Louvois to low-level clerks, intendants, and record keepers, constituted the machinery that made the monarchy operational on a daily basis. Their work, often invisible and repetitive, was critical to maintaining authority across a geographically and socially complex kingdom. The visible power of the Sun King, expressed in Versailles, armies, and public ceremony, rested entirely upon this largely unseen foundation of bureaucratic diligence. One of the most significant outcomes of this administrative system was the standardization of governance. Provincial administration, fiscal collection, legal enforcement, and military oversight were no longer left to the discretion of local elites or independent nobles. Instead, a structured network of officials implemented policies in a consistent and coordinated manner, all under the watchful eyes of the king and his ministers. Routine reporting, correspondence, and inspections ensured that deviations were detected and corrected. The repetition of these procedural tasks, though tedious, created a predictable and stable framework of governance, one that allowed the monarchy to project power and maintain control across France. Finance exemplified the importance of these bureaucratic functions. Colbert's reforms relied not only on policy innovation but also on the consistent application of procedures throughout the kingdom. Tax collection, regulation of trade, management of state monopolies, and oversight of expenditures required daily attention. Clerks compiled ledgers, intendant reports were analyzed, and officials ensured compliance at every level. These repetitive, methodical processes may appear mundane, yet they underpin the monarchy's ability to fund military campaigns, sustain Versailles, and maintain diplomatic influence abroad. Without this administrative diligence, the grandeur of Louis XIV's reign would have collapsed under its own weight. Military operations similarly depended on bureaucratic labor. The coordination of troop movements, provisioning recruitment, and strategic planning demanded precision and oversight. Ministers and administrators managed the logistical and organizational framework that allowed France to sustain large-scale campaigns over long periods. The boring work of records, orders, and inspections directly translated into operational effectiveness demonstrate that the success of the French army relied as much on the diligence of administrators as on battlefield valor. In this sense, bureaucracy was inseparable from power itself. Cultural and religious oversight also reflected the critical role of ministers. By coordinating festivals, theater performances, and religious ceremonies, officials ensured that public displays reinforced royal authority and social hierarchy. Church appointments, supervision of clergy, and management of religious institutions aligned spiritual legitimacy with the crown's priorities. Even the repetition of mundane tasks, reviewing clergy reports, preparing ceremonial schedules, or ensuring compliance with orthodoxy, was instrumental in consolidating centralized control. Through these repetitive acts, ministers extended the king's authority into nearly every aspect of social and cultural life. Yet, the reliance on ministers and bureaucrats also revealed the monarchy's vulnerabilities. The system depended on competence, loyalty, and diligence. Negligence, corruption, or ambition among officials could undermine governance, provoke unrest, or disrupt fiscal stability. The repeated procedures that ensured order in ordinary times could become brittle under extraordinary pressure. Rebellions, famine, or sudden military threats posed challenges that tested not only the bureaucracy's efficiency but also the monarchy's capacity for oversight and adaptation. This tension between routine stability and extraordinary crisis highlights a central paradox of Bourbon governance. The very structures that enabled centralized power were also dependent on careful, constant maintenance. The Sun King's meticulous attention to ministerial work through daily audiences, correspondence, and oversight ensured that the bureaucracy functioned effectively. By integrating ministers and officials into a hierarchical, monitored system, Louis XIV maintained both control and accountability. Authority flowed through the network of ministers, yet the king remained the ultimate arbiter, the visible center of power whose oversight guaranteed loyalty and consistency. In effect, the monarchy became a system of interlocking routines. Observation and procedural enforcement demonstrate that the stability of the state depended on the careful management of boring administrative labor. The story of ministers and bureaucrats in Bourbon France reveals a broader historical lesson. Governance, especially in complex societies, relies heavily on the ordinary, repetitive, and procedural work that often escapes notice. While battles, treaties, and grand displays dominate popular imagination, it was the disciplined, methodical, and largely invisible work of administrators that sustained authority and maintained stability. These officials transformed royal intent into practical outcomes, ensuring that decrees were implemented, taxes were collected, and social order was maintained. The boring aspects of administration were in fact the bedrock of monarchical power, and yet, even as the system operated with remarkable efficiency, questions remained. Could the monarchy endure when confronted with crises beyond the scope of routine governance? How resilient was a system so dependent on repetitive procedures and personal oversight when facing rebellion, financial collapse, or war? The answers to these questions would shape the trajectory of the Bourbon Dynasty in the decades following Louis XIV's reign, illustrating both the strength and the limits of a governance system built on careful observation, meticulous procedure, and the invisible labor of ministers and bureaucrats. In reflecting on the role of these figures, we see that history is often shaped not by extraordinary events alone, but by the diligent, repetitive, and largely invisible work that underpins society. The ministers and bureaucrats of Bourbon France exemplify how boring labor administration, oversight, and procedure can wield profound influence, sustaining dynasties, shaping policy, and leaving enduring imprint on the course of history. Versailles is often remembered for its opulent halls, sprawling gardens, and the grandeur that symbolizes the Sun King's absolute power. Yet beyond its aesthetic brilliance, Versailles functioned as a carefully designed instrument of governance, a physical manifestation of centralized authority. Its architecture, spatial layout, and daily routines were meticulously planned to control behavior, structure social hierarchies, and consolidate power. The palace was not simply a residence or a stage for ceremony. It was a mechanism through which Louis XIV exercised dominance over his nobles, courtiers, and officials, embedding authority into the very spaces they occupied. The transformation of Versailles from a hunting lodge into the primary royal palace began in earnest in 1661, when Louis XIV assumed personal rule following the death of Cardinal Mazarin. The young king sought to centralize authority and reduce the influence of potentially rebellious nobles, many of whom had grown accustomed to exercising power in their provincial domains. Versailles offered an elegant solution. By requiring nobles to reside at court for extended periods, Louis could monitor, manipulate, and control them while simultaneously keeping them dependent on royal favor. The physical design of the palace was inseparable from this political strategy. Every corridor, staircase, and courtyard dictated movement, visibility, and access. The architecture itself became a tool of governance. The layout of Versailles reflected careful attention to hierarchy and social order. Proximity to the king's apartments or the ceremonial spaces of the palace signaled status, influence, and privilege. Courtiers navigated a rigidly structured environment in which gestures, positioning, and attendance carried meaning. Simple acts where one knelt, which door one used, or how one approached the king were codified by custom and observation. By embedding social hierarchy into spatial organization, the palace allowed Louis XIV to regulate behavior in a way that extended beyond the written law or formal decree. Authority was not only asserted, it was internalized by those who occupied the space. The daily rhythm at Versailles further reinforced the monarchy's control. The lever and coucher ceremonies, during which the king rose and retired in the presence of select courtiers, became complex performances that demonstrated both status and dependence. Attendance was carefully choreographed. The sequence of participation, the manner of approach, and the timing of interactions all reinforced hierarchical structures. These repetitive, ritualized events were far from mere spectacle. They were mechanisms for social training, creating a system in which nobles learned to defer, observe, and compete for favor within tightly prescribed bounds. Through routine and repetition, the palace itself became a school of loyalty and obedience. Versailles gardens and public spaces served a similar purpose. Expansive terraces, fountains, and avenues were not only aesthetic marvels but also tools of social management. Public promenades allowed the king to be visible to courtiers while simultaneously controlling the flow of movement and interaction. Visitors could be observed, behaviors could be monitored, and social hierarchies were constantly reinforced through spatial arrangement. Even seemingly leisurely activities, walking, attending concerts, or enjoying fountain, were choreographed with precision to sustain order and convey authority. In this way, the environment itself became an instrument of political control. The palace also centralized administrative functions. Key ministers, clerks, and advisors were drawn into Versailles, bringing the machinery of governance into the king's immediate sphere. Meetings, correspondence, and bureaucratic oversight all occurred within proximity to the monarch, allowing for direct observation and immediate intervention. This physical consolidation of administration was more than convenient. It was strategic. By bringing governance into the palace, Louis XIV ensured that authority, procedure, and hierarchy were intertwined with everyday life, creating a system in which political and spatial organization reinforced one another. The construction of Versailles was also a statement of power that extended beyond courtly rituals. Its scale, materials, and design communicated the monarchy's dominance to visiting dignitaries, foreign ambassadors, and the broader French population. The palace's grandeur projected the king's authority through architecture itself, making the power of the monarchy visible, tangible, and seemingly unassailable. Yet this projection relied on careful management. The palace required an extensive workforce, continuous maintenance, and ongoing coordination of daily routines. Behind the glittering surfaces lay a network of repetitive, procedural work, from the upkeep of gardens to the management of servants, that enabled the palace to function as both a residence and instrument of control. Even the smallest spaces within Versailles were designed with political intention. Private chambers, corridors, and salons dictated movement and visibility, creating opportunities for observation and subtle influence. Courtiers learned the proximity to power required adherence to unspoken rules, constant vigilance, and participation in ritual. The architecture itself trained individuals to internalize hierarchy, demonstrating that authority could be exercised not only through decree or coercion but through the careful design of space, routine, and opportunity. Religious spaces within the palace further reinforced authority. Chapels and areas for mass-integrated spiritual legitimacy with the physical and social structure of Versailles. The king's visible participation in religious observance emphasized divine sanction, while the placement of courtiers and clergy within these spaces reflected hierarchy. Ritual, architecture, and visibility combined to create a multi-layered system of power in which spatial arrangement, social order, and ceremonial practice were inseparable. The operation of Versailles depended on an extensive network of servants, administrators, and functionaries. Their work, repetitive and often invisible, was critical to maintaining the palace as both a residence and a tool of governance. Meals had to be prepared and served according to strict ritual, candles lit and maintained with precision, reports filed, letters delivered, and ceremonial schedules coordinated. The palace's splendor relied as much on this boring labor as on the artistic vision of architects and designers. Without the diligence of these individuals, the mechanisms of control embedded in Versailles, design would falter, and the carefully constructed hierarchy of courtly life could unravel. In examining Versailles, it becomes clear that architecture and ritual were inseparable from political strategy. The palace was a physical embodiment of the monarchy's authority, a site where hierarchy, visibility, and social behavior were meticulously regulated. Through repetitive ceremonies, choreographed movement, and spatial organization, Louis XIV created an environment in which power was both visible and internalized. The grandeur of Versailles was not merely ornamental, it was functional, a tool for governance that relied on the careful orchestration of both space and human behavior. Yet, even with such meticulous design, a question lingers. Could the central, ritualized environment of Versailles sustain authority indefinitely? Or would the reliance on routine, observation, and control leave the monarchy vulnerable to rebellion, mismanagement, or social change? The palace's beauty and precision concealed both the power it wielded and the fragility inherent in a system so dependent on constant attention and participation. The answers to these questions would unfold over the decades, testing whether the architecture of power could endure beyond the reign of the Sun King.